So a week ago I saw Northflower do this fun challenge called the Clan Generator Challenge, and I thought it looked really interesting. I'm always someone who's willing to stretch my warrior's creative design skills and really just mess around with a weird little story. So I opened up the generator, rolled a few until I got one that I was interested in, which is BarrenClan, the Irritable and Cowardly. So after looking through all the characters and seeing what kind of designs they had, I started forming a story in my mind, because I'm a comic author and it's literally impossible for me to meet any kind of challenge without immediately wanting to make some grand story out of it. So I came up with backstory and personality and history for this clan, why it's called BarrenClan, and why it's irritable and cowardly. So here's a brief description, which is: many seasons ago, 4 clans lived in a lush prairie, with one called Rose Clan living at the top of the hill. One day, Rose Clan spotted an ominous dark shape moving toward the clan from outside the borders, like an advancing army. Their leader, Wheatstar, afraid of what might be coming, evacuated Rose Clan without telling any of the others. They ran to a small forest many miles away, where they stayed for some half a year until a forest fire drove them to return. Horrified, Wheatstar was met with a ravaged landscape, with no sign of the other 3 clans except for bones in the earth. Not long after, a drought took hold of the already damaged landscape and swept away even more life. In a fit of despair, Wheatstar renamed Rose Clan to BarrenClan, saying that their cowardice had brought this fate upon the clans. With nowhere else to go, and the cats already weak and tired, BarrenClan clung to the diseased land that symbolized their failure, becoming a hardy and irritable group. And in the quote-unquote current time that this story would take place, many years have passed since all this stuff happened. None of the living cats were ever a part of Rose Clan. BarrenClan is pretty small because of food shortages, so all the cats are slightly starved looking, which is something I tried to include in the designs. And there are always concerns about feeding kits, so there's never more than one nursing queen. The isolation and the above average amount of she-cats, the genetic pool is getting kind of small in BarrenClan, which I thought could potentially play into the story in interesting ways I'll talk about later. And it's sort of a scrappy traditionalist clan that's kind of afraid of change and maybe a little bit masochistic with punishing themselves because of their history. And I'll start describing all the characters. So the leader is Mallowstar, who was a short-haired white tom with green eyes. I made him sort of a middle-aged wife guy who's very agreeable and tries to make the best out of a bad situation. His mate is Blacknose. He gets along well with his kids and he sort of treats them like his buddies. He tries to get Redpelt to relax, his deputy, and Mallowstar is getting somewhat disillusioned with BarrenClan's isolationist history and its politics. The deputy is Redpelt, a black and red classic calico tabby she-cat with long fur and blue eyes. She's an absolute mess of anxiety. She's always tying herself into knots over worrying about small details, and despite her being a good warrior, she has this feeling of imposter syndrome and feels like Mallowstar shouldn't have made her the deputy. In my notes I wrote down that she has Holly Gibney energy, who's a character from a Stephen King series of books, but it's very accurate for Redpelt. The medicine cat is Cootstorm, a short-haired black-ticked tabby she-cat with green eyes. She's an older and pretty pretentious kind of lady. Like, she always has to be the smartest person in the conversation, and she gets very annoyed if you interrupt her, even though she's a total hypocrite and would absolutely interrupt you. She bickers constantly with her apprentice Pinepaw. I just really wanted to give her a personality that reminded me of the word coot, like calling someone an old coot, even though I know that it's also a species of bird. Now we can move on to the warriors. So for the warriors, the first one is Egrettail, a short-haired black and red mackerel calico she-cat with amber eyes. So Egrettail and Cormorantpaw were previously Egret and Cormorant, who arrived in camp one day, nearly like delirious with thirst and starving and really just in bad shape, and they were allowed to stay by BarrenClan, who's afraid of getting too small. Egrettail kind of seems like she's always tired, and she's very evasive about her past. She won't talk about where she and Cormorantpaw came from, but in general she tries to get along well with the other cats, and it seems like she's settling into BarrenClan. There's Plumstripe, a white she-cat with short fur and gold eyes. She has a very strong rivalry going on with her sister Beeface, and pretends like she doesn't know about it. Like, she kind of acts like, oh, there's no rivalry. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to be a good warrior over here. She kind of works hard to put on a chill and laid-back appearance. It's not really genuine. She's kind of tight and inside. And she kind of thinks that Redpelt should just stop being so nervous. Like, imagine those people who are like, well, if you're depressed, you should just do some yoga and look at the sun. Next is Beeface, a mostly white, black and red classic calico she-cat with short fur and copper eyes. She has no illusions of coolness like her sister Plumstripe, and she always expresses everything very strongly, kind of melodramatically. Also, a lot of these descriptions call cats red, which in my Flamesnout world means literally red, but when I look it up, red is a term that kind of describes ginger. So some of these cats that are called red, I actually put them more on the red side, but like with Beeface and later Blacknose, I made them more of an orangey ginger kind of reddish color. Onto the apprentices, we have Pinepaw, a short-haired blue tom with yellow eyes. He was excited to become a medicine cat apprentice, but he finds his patience wearing kind of thin as he deals with the unpleasant Cootstorm. Pinepaw has big ideas for his future and high ambitions for solving all of BarrenClan's problems. He's always kind of getting himself into trouble, the typical kind of nosy, curious protagonist. He's under a lot of pressure for being one of only 3 toms in the clan, and before Cormorantpaw arrived, he was one of only 2, with the other being Mallowstar. So he's kind of got this background pressure from his whole family to, you know, find a mate. But he finds Cormorantpaw's Mystique oddly charming, so there could be something going on between them. And in this supposed story that I was creating in my head about BarrenClan, Pinepaw would be the main character. You know, he's the new apprentice, he's under a lot of pressure, and he's trying to uncover the secrets of BarrenClan. He's got two siblings. Daffodilpaw is the first one. She is a short-haired, cream-spotted tabby she-cat with amber eyes. Some of these descriptions are so hard to say. Daffodilpaw tries very hard to be friends with everyone, and everyone can kind of see that she's like earnestly trying, and they respect her for that. She's just also kind of annoying, which it's a little hard because you know it's not her fault, but sometimes you kind of want to be like, Daffodilpaw, stop talking, can you just leave me alone? She kind of reminds me a little bit of young Dovepaw, if you want to think of her that way. You may notice that Daffodilpaw has a twisted hind leg, and I sort of imagine that when she was a kit, she was stung by a scorpion, and everyone thought that she wouldn't pull through. And eventually she did, but she was left with sort of a limp, numb foot that didn't work very well. But she still became a warrior's apprentice, because as long as she can, you know, catch food and survive in BarrenClan's tough environment, they don't really care about it. And then the third sibling in their litter is Asphodelpaw, a blue and cream classic tortoiseshell tabby she-cat with short fur and amber eyes. She's a very young, smug, and vain cat who doesn't try very hard during training. She kind of assumes things will just work out for her. I imagine she's pretty proud of her, like, sleek fur and pretty design, so she's not trying very hard. I think she probably picks on Pinepaw sometimes, out of the siblings. And the last apprentice is Cormorantpaw, a short-haired black tom with hazel eyes. He came along with Egrettail from when they lived outside the clans. Cormorantpaw is a very strange, quiet, and serious young apprentice. He always kind of seems to be lost in thought. He's always kind of creepily observing his clanmates and seeming to wait for some unknown event. I imagine in this story, which would be sort of a mystery kind of story, with Pinepaw trying to figure out what happened to BarrenClan in the past, where they came from, why they're here, where Egret and Cormorantpaw came from. And with Cormorantpaw, you kind of never know what he's up to. He always seems to have some sort of secret plan. Onto the queens, we have Slugpelt, a short-haired white she-cat with blue and cream mackerel calico tail and ears and hazel eyes. I find the fact that slug is a possible prefix in this generator so funny. So I made it the story that Slugpelt got along very badly with her mother, who she blamed for giving her the name Slug, and her mom was very obviously biased towards her Slugpelt's brother, who she thought was obviously the golden child. And then, you know, one day, her brother and mother disappeared into the desert and haven't been seen since. which would be another mystery that Pinepaw is trying to figure out what happened to his mother's brother, his uncle. Slugpelt is pretty prickly, and she's closed off to most cats. She doesn't get along very well with anyone in the clan and always sort of does her own thing. Next is Blacknose, a black and red ticked calico she-cat with short fur and gold eyes. Blacknose spends a lot of her time daydreaming and kind of wishing she lived somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't like a horrible ravaged desert. Blacknose has been spending more and more time talking with Egrettail lately. She's sort of doe-eyed and slow, she's a little bit of a daydreamer. So currently Blacknose is pregnant and Slugpelt's kits are young apprentices and they're out of the nursery, but I imagine the queens tend to stay in camp and take care of things like repairing, cleaning, and collecting water. And lastly, we have the elders. First is Nightberry, a black she-cat with short fur and green eyes. She can be very pessimistic and doom and gloom at times, but for the most part she meets well. And she's most relaxed when she's with Cypressfoot, who is her mate. Nightberry was a very strict single mother, because the kit's father was a loner, and her kits are Cootstorm, Redpelt, and Blacknose. Cypressfoot is a mostly white, chocolate and red classic calico she-cat with long fur and hazel eyes. She's very sweet and kind of grandmotherly, but she does have a very sharp wit, and she totally dotes on her mate Nightberry. Her father was a warrior when RoseClan existed, and he told her stories of the times when Cypressfoot was growing up. She's since forgotten the name RoseClan instead of BarrenClan though, because she's pretty old. And since Redpelt looks a lot like her, but Cypressfoot wasn't her mother, Nightberry thinks it's a gift from StarClan, saying that they, approve of their relationship, because Redpelt looks so much like Cypressfoot and not Nightberry. So that's BarrenClan. I think this would be a sort of fun, more spooky and eerie Warriors mystery, comic or story or whatever, with Pinepaw trying to figure out just what happened to his clan, all the secrets, where Egret and Cormorant came from, and all those sorts of things. It was a really fun challenge to do, and I encourage anyone to at least play with the generator, see what comes up. You might find something interesting.